I had waited 5 years for this moment, and now, here it was, hanging in the air like the last breath of a dying man. My father stood at the head of the table, glass raised high, his smile wide as he looked at Ben, the golden boy who had disappeared without a trace, only to return after rehab, freshly scrubbed, and somehow deserving of everything I had worked for. Everything I had sacrificed. Tonight, we pass the torch, Dad's voice boomed, rich with pride as he grinned down at Ben, to the one who's proven he belongs at the helm. His hand rested on Ben's shoulder, like a father giving a blessing, but it felt more like a death sentence. I felt my blood burn at the lie hanging between them. I could hardly look at Ben. He sat there, grinning, wearing his usual, practiced expression. The one that always made him look like he had somehow earned everything. The one that masked the truth. The one that hid his years of addiction, his careless choices, and his absence when this family needed someone to hold it together. Mom's gaze flicked between Ben and me, her eyes gleaming with that sickly pride that had always been reserved for him. "He deserves it," she said, the words sweet but cold. The warmth in her voice made me feel like I was hearing something wrong, as if my own blood wasn't enough to warrant the same recognition. The room clapped. The sound was hollow. I felt like I was choking on it. Ben's eyes locked with mine for a moment, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face, before he quickly masked it with another of his confident smiles. But I knew better. I saw the cracks, the same cracks I'd spent years fixing while he was out there wasting his life. I slowly stood from my chair. I didn't say a word, just pushed my chair back, the scrape of it loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the room. All eyes were on me. I could feel their judgment, their expectations. I walked to the head of the table, my hands steady, as I placed 4 things in front of my father, one by one. The power of attorney, signed when neither of them could even hold a pen. The house keys, the ones he'd given me when I moved back. The ones that had opened every door to memories I wished I could forget. The safe key, the one that had held everything. The thing that could destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. Finally, the thick envelope, sealed with red notary wax. The thing I knew would turn this whole thing upside down. I didn't flinch as I slid them across the table toward him. "Congrats, Ben," I said, my voice soft, but firm enough that it could be heard across the room. The silence was deafening. Dad looked down at the documents, his smile faltering, but only for a second. He probably thought it was some dramatic goodbye note. Another one of my little outbursts, a desperate attempt for attention. But I was done with trying to get their approval. He picked up the envelope, his fingers shaking just slightly as he slid the butter knife beneath the seal. I watched, knowing exactly what he'd find. I met Ben's stare, calm, unflinching, my heart pounding in my chest as the seconds ticked by. Then it happened. The glass slipped from Dad's hand. It shattered on the hardwood floor. "You've got to be kidding me," he roared, slamming his hand down so hard the plates jumped, sending a shockwave through the room. His voice was a mix of disbelief and rage. But I didn't flinch. Mom screamed, "What is it? Richard, what is it?" Her voice was high-pitched, panic setting in as she looked between Dad and me, confusion clouding her face. Ben froze. Not a muscle moved in his body. He wasn't smiling anymore. No, this was real. This was the moment he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. I didn't turn back. I kept walking. Out of that room, away from the lies, from the years of giving everything only to be thrown aside. The weight of their stares followed me, but I didn't care. Not anymore. I knew what was coming next. The truth would break them, and I would finally be free. I thought I had it all figured out when I left for Seattle. The job, the company, the freedom. I was doing what I loved, surrounded by the best minds in the tech industry. My future seemed endless, until the phone rang that Tuesday morning. I had never forgotten the feeling of that call. The charge nurse at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, her voice calm but urgent. Your father's had a massive ischemic stroke, He's being prepped for emergency surgery now. The words hit like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. In the span of a minute, everything changed. I packed 2 suitcases, not knowing what I was walking into. When I landed in Minneapolis, I was greeted by the sterile, cold air of a hospital that felt like it was swallowing me whole. Dad was in a medically induced coma, machines breathing for him. And Mom, she was in her own battle. What she thought was bronchitis turned out to be stage 3 lung cancer. 6 weeks later, she was skin and bones. I stayed with her at the hospital, even when I couldn't be at Dad's side. The sound of the IV drip, the sterile smell of disinfectant, those became my world. I lost track of time. I don't think I slept more than a few hours at a time. My company in Seattle had been understanding, offering me all the time I needed, but they didn't wait for me. They replaced me in 9 days. Those first few months are all a blur now. There were hospital shifts, long nights spent in the ICU with Dad, and hours spent at home mixing chemo drugs for Mom, who could barely lift a coffee cup. I taught myself everything I could about corporate finance, watching YouTube videos, on late nights after the nurses left. I did everything. Signed contracts, negotiated with vendors, kept the company afloat while Mom lost weight faster than anyone should. There was never any time for me. Not once did I ask for help. This was my burden. This was my responsibility. And I carried it. I carried them both through every long night, every hospital appointment, every meeting with insurance companies. I became the CEO of Quincy Medical Supply, by default, yes, but I was still running it. Still keeping it together, even when I felt like I might fall apart. I spent so many nights on the vinyl recliner in Dad's ICU room that it became my bed. The only thing I could do was watch him, his eyes closed, trying to wake up from the coma. I remember when he first blinked, just once, the tiniest movement. And then, later, the first time he squeezed my hand, 2 squeezes for yes, 1 for no. That was how we communicated for the next few months. There was no gratitude in his eyes, no apology. Just the deep, silent regret of a man who couldn't speak for himself. Mom fought too. She fought for every inch of her health, her life. The cancer didn't give up easily, but neither did she. I fought too, for the company, for them. I fought for everything I believed in, until I couldn't fight anymore. And then, after a year, something shifted. I could see it in their eyes. Dad's silent guilt, Mom's overwhelming need to fix things, to make up for the past. She said it, one night, after a family dinner. He's coming back, Aubrey. Ben's coming home. Ben. The golden boy. The one who had vanished years ago, lost to his addiction. The one who had walked away from the family, from everything, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I hated him for it, and I hated myself for still caring. But Mom kept saying it would all be okay, that Ben would make it better. I didn't believe her. When Ben finally showed up on the porch, the doorbell ringing at 7 a.m., I was elbow deep in payroll reports. I hadn't slept in 31 hours. I wasn't ready for him, not after everything. His face was different. Cleaner. He was thinner, his eyes clearer than I had seen in years. He was wearing an old army duffel, looking like he had just stepped out of a rehab center. My stomach twisted in knots, but I didn't show it. I couldn't. Mom ran from the kitchen, her robe swishing behind her. The moment she saw him, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. It wasn't a reunion. It was an exorcism, and it wasn't for me. Not anymore. Within an hour, the entire family was buzzing with excitement. Ben's back. Ben's home. He's clean. I watched it all from the edge of the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter, trying to hold myself together. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and second chances. But I knew better. This wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about Ben finding his way back. It was about rewriting his story to fit their narrative. And I wasn't a part of it anymore. The lies started immediately. Ben hadn't been an addict, Mom insisted. No, he'd been out there, networking, learning the business. He'd been finding himself. That was the story they were going to tell now. And somehow, I was supposed to accept that. The moment Ben walked into the company, like nothing had ever happened, my blood ran cold. I saw it. I saw the way Mom beamed at him, the way she ushered him straight to the executive floor. She introduced him to the leadership team, as though he had been running the company this whole time. I stood there, frozen, as Ben shook hands with Mark, the one who owed his entire job to me. Mark, who had always respected me, now treated Ben like royalty. I watched the scene unfold, as if it were happening to someone else. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just a bystander in my own life anymore. Ben didn't waste any time making himself comfortable. It was as if he had never been gone, never left the family behind. It was like the 5 years I had spent keeping everything together didn't matter. Like I hadn't put my life on hold, sacrificed everything I had for this family, for this company. No, to them, it was like he had just been on some extended vacation. Mom never stopped calling him her boy. Her eyes lit up whenever he entered the room, as if he were the second coming of everything she'd dreamed about. And Ben, he soaked it in, like it was his due, as if his return from rehab and a few months of finding himself made him the heir to the throne. But I saw through it. I saw the cracks in his story. He had changed, sure. He wasn't the gaunt, wild-eyed kid I had last seen, high and wasted on the couch in a state of permanent escape. But Ben was still the same. He still carried that entitled air, that indifference to everything except what he wanted. I spent hours on the couch, just watching him, watching how effortlessly he slipped back into the family's narrative. How quickly he began leading meetings with the executive team, how everyone catered to him. And then I watched as my access to the company's accounts was slowly choked off. One morning, I sat down to review a contract with one of our biggest suppliers, but when I went to log in, my password was rejected. I tried again, and then again. Nothing. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I called the IT team. Your login has been reset for security reasons, they said, as if it were a routine part of the process. I knew what it meant. It was Ben's move, his takeover. I could feel the walls closing in as my control slipped through my fingers. I couldn't let it happen. Not after everything. When I asked Dad about it, he shrugged it off. Mom thought it was time Ben took the reins, he said in his usual detached tone. The man who had once been the rock of this family, the one who had taught me how to run a company, had already given up on me. And I felt it, every word, every glance. His defeat was in his eyes, in the way he passed the responsibility to Ben, without a second thought. I was done trying to prove myself, so I went to the factory floor instead. It was the only place I could think to go. I entered through the back, unnoticed by anyone. The factory was empty at this hour, and the dim light from the overhead lamps cast long shadows across the cold concrete. I stood there, for a moment, just breathing, trying to shake off the feeling of being completely invisible in a place I had built from the ground up. I took my seat at a vacant cubicle on the third floor, far from the executive wing, where Ben was already making decisions. I hadn't used this space in years, but it was familiar. It was the last place where I still had some power. But even here, I felt the shift. The company was no longer mine. The next few days were a blur. Ben began holding daily stand-ups in the conference room I used to run. He wore pressed shirts, his sleeves always neatly rolled up, like he had stepped right out of some management textbook. He spoke in corporate jargon: synergy, vertical integration, disruptive growth, and the employees. They treated him like he was their savior. The ones who still nodded at me in the hallways. Their eyes were down, like they knew better than to acknowledge me. It was as if I no longer existed in their world, not as a leader, but as a ghost. Mom redecorated Ben's old bedroom the first weekend. She made it his kingdom. A new mattress, a new desk, photos of him from high school football. A sign on the door that said Ben, future CEO. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I saw it. But I couldn't bring myself to do either. The house had become a monument to a version of Ben that had never existed. And me. I kept showing up, like a shadow in my own life. I kept doing the work that no one else wanted to, while they all pretended that the last 5 years hadn't happened. Every time I tried to speak up, Dad would look to Ben. Every time I had an idea, Ben would shoot it down. "Let your brother handle it, honey," Mom would say, her smile tight with a hidden cruelty. "You've done enough." I couldn't argue anymore. What was the point? They had made their choice, and there was no place for me in their future. Not anymore. I tried to find solace in the work. I kept the company alive, kept pushing through the long nights. But every hour spent in that cold, empty office, alone with the ghost of the person I used to be, chipped away at me. One night, I walked past Ben's door. The sign that said future CEO gleamed in the dim light. For the first time in weeks, I stopped. I stood there, my hand on the doorframe, staring at the name that no longer meant anything to me. That name, Ben, was a symbol of everything I had lost. It wasn't the company that mattered anymore. It was the years I had wasted on them, the loyalty I had given without ever being asked for it. And I was done. The next morning, I packed my bag. I wasn't leaving forever, but I was leaving this family, this lie, behind. The past was gone. It was time for me to take control. For once, it was my turn to walk away. The night after Ben's first full day in the office, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, eerily so. The silence wrapped itself around me like a heavy cloak, suffocating, but it was also freeing. There was no one to pretend for anymore. No one to hide my bitterness from. I wasn't going to let them break me. Not again. I'd been silent for far too long. The days that followed were nothing short of a slow, relentless unraveling. The cracks in the family facade became harder to ignore. They were all too busy basking in Ben's so-called redemption to notice that he was taking everything that I had built, piece by piece. Mom threw herself into his success, a proud smile plastered on her face, every time he walked into the room. Ben was the future, the heir to the empire they had forgotten I was holding together. It was sickening to watch. It felt like my whole life had been reduced to a footnote in their little storybook. The tragedy was that they didn't even see it. Not once did they acknowledge the years of sacrifice I had put in. Not once did they think about what it had cost me to keep the company running while they both fell apart. One afternoon, Ben called a family meeting to strategize about the company's future. I knew what this was. It was another show. Another one of those speeches where he'd stand in front of us all, pretending like he had any clue what he was talking about. I didn't even bother sitting at the table. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, my eyes fixed on him as he gave his pitch to a room full of yes men. We need to streamline operations, push for more disruptive growth, he said, rattling off buzzwords like he'd been reading a business manual. Our market share isn't where it should be. We're not maximizing our potential. I wanted to laugh. It wasn't even about the company anymore. It was about him. About his need to make everyone believe that he was the savior, that he was the one who could fix everything. But I knew better than anyone. All he was doing was covering up for the fact that he had no idea how to run this company. That he hadn't been there when it mattered. I walked out of the meeting, ignoring the glance of concern that Mark, the coup, shot me as I passed. He knew better than anyone how much I had done, how much I had carried. But he had already chosen his side. He had already decided that Ben was the future. And I was the past. The next day, it happened. I tried to log into the company systems again, only to find my credentials had been revoked. My account, my access gone. No warning, no explanation. Just a silent, calculated severing of the last connection I had to the life I had fought to protect. I called the IT department, and they told me the same thing I'd heard before. Your access has been reset for security reasons. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what was going on. Ben had wiped me out of the equation. Completely. That was when I knew I had to act. I had to do something, anything, before I lost everything. Before they took away the last shred of control I had over my own future. The following week, I began making calls, quietly, to the lawyers I had kept in the shadows. I had learned the intricacies of business law from late-night research, from making decisions at 3 a.m. when I should have been sleeping. It was time to use that knowledge. Time to turn the tables on them. The paperwork had already been signed years ago. When Dad and Mom were incapacitated, when they couldn't even hold a pen. But the trust wasn't in place until I had made sure it was. They had no idea what I had done. The trust was already set up, and once the documents were executed, everything they thought they controlled would belong to me. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the company. This was bigger than that. This was about reclaiming what was mine, what I had earned. It was about showing them that I would not be forgotten, that I would not be swept under the rug like I was some footnote in their twisted version of family history. I watched Ben as he strolled through the halls, his new power suit pressed and perfect, his office already filled with accolades he didn't deserve. He was confident, maybe even cocky, and I could feel the bitterness rise in my throat. But I was done letting him win. I had already secured my future, and they had no idea what was coming. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I was going to play mine. I sat down in the dimly lit office, the one that used to be mine. I looked at the papers spread across the desk. I had signed my name in every one of them, but this time, it wasn't just my name, it was the power I had earned. And now, I was going to use it. Ben thought he was the one who had all the power, but he was wrong. I was going to take it all back, piece by piece. And when I was done, he would never forget who really held the reins. I wasn't just the quiet one anymore. I was the one who had won. The day I placed the final documents in front of my father at the inheritance dinner felt like the moment I had been waiting for. But in reality, that was only the beginning. The moment the seal was broken and Dad read those words aloud, everything shifted, everything changed. They had no idea what they were about to face. After the dinner, I left the house, but not without a sense of finality hanging in the air. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I knew it would be catastrophic for them. The pieces were in place. The trust was irrevocable. And once the notifications hit the financial institutions, they would have no choice but to accept it. I didn't return home immediately. I stayed away, trying to make sense of the weight I was carrying. Every decision I had made had led to this point. It wasn't just revenge. It wasn't even about proving I was better. It was about ownership of my past, my future, my sacrifice. The phone call came 3 days later. "Richard, it's done. They've frozen everything," Gregory said, his voice calm, but the fear in it was unmistakable. The trust notification hit their legal department first thing this morning. I hadn't realized how much I had been bracing for this moment until it hit me. My pulse quickened, my breath caught in my throat. My parents were no longer in control. They had no leverage. It was all gone. They had spent years building their empire, but it wasn't theirs anymore. The paperwork, the power of attorney. They had signed away every right they had to the company. Everything that once belonged to them now belonged to the Quincy Health Foundation, and no one could touch it. Not even them. I stayed in the background for the next few days, watching as the house filled with chaos. Dad, for the first time in years, was awake and furious. His hands trembled as he clutched the papers I had left behind, his face a mask of disbelief. Mom, ever the enabler, couldn't look at me. Her eyes were filled with a deep, quiet resentment. Ben. He was lost, fumbling around in the wreckage, too consumed with anger to understand what had just happened. But I couldn't be bothered with their confusion. I had already won. The legal battle was over before it had even started. The trust was locked. No one could undo it. Not their court orders, not their lawyers, not even their threats. And then, just as I had anticipated, the emails began to flood in. The first came from the bank, access revoked. Trust freeze in effect. Then came the notices from the accounting department, payroll suspended. Due to unforeseen banking restrictions. My phone rang incessantly. I ignored every call, knowing exactly what it meant. The foundation had already seized everything. The company's future, its financial stability, had just crumbled in front of my eyes. I hadn't even needed to lift a finger. The system had done it all for me. I watched the destruction unfold, and yet, there was a strange sense of calm in me. No guilt, no regret. Only satisfaction. I let Ben throw his tantrums, watched him scream and rage, but I didn't engage. He was still the same spoiled child, the one who had disappeared when things got hard. And now, he was paying the price. I felt no sympathy for him. The company had never been his to claim. No matter how many times Mom tried to spin her little tale about how he had been the entrepreneur in training, or whatever lie she had fed herself. My father sat in his chair, staring blankly at the documents, his mouth working without sound, trying to come to terms with the fact that everything he had worked for was now in the hands of a lawyer, a trustee, a foundation that had no ties to him or his family. He tried to call me. Of course, he did. I knew he would. But I didn't pick up. I didn't have to. I wasn't going back to fix things. I wasn't going to explain myself, not to them, not to anyone. I had already sacrificed too much to be shackled to the past. Later that night, after the shock had begun to settle in, I received a notification from the company's investor relations team. My new venture, Quincy Health Systems, had just secured a massive contract with Coleman Regional Health Network. They were the next big thing in healthcare, and the news had just hit the wire. The deal was worth $62 million, and it was all mine. My company, the one I had built while everyone else was too busy fighting over their legacy, was now the one they had to worry about. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in. The family's empire was crumbling, while mine was just beginning. I had beaten them. I had taken everything they thought they could claim and turned it into something better. Something real. The next morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was from Gregory, the family lawyer. "Richard's asking if you'll reconsider," he said. "He wants to settle this without further damage to the family." I almost laughed. Settle, There was nothing to settle. The moment they signed those papers, they sealed their fate. I had given them every opportunity to make it right, to see me as more than just the one who cleaned up their mess. But now, it was over. "I'm not interested in your settlement," I said flatly. "This is my victory. And it's final." I hung up the phone without another word. They could never undo what had been done. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: freedom. The day of the inheritance dinner, everything was set in motion. I had watched them celebrate Ben, a parade in his honor, as if he had won some great battle. And in their eyes, he had. He was their golden boy. The one who had finally come back to reclaim what was rightfully his. But they didn't know what I had done. They couldn't possibly understand how thoroughly I had prepared for this moment. When I walked out of that room, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was about to unfold. And I knew it would be glorious. I had anticipated the moment Dad would crack, his eyes scanning the papers, the shock slowly dawning on him. the exact moment when he realized everything was slipping away from him. The moment when Ben, the golden boy, realized he hadn't just been handed the company, he had been handed a wrecked empire, and he would have to build it back up from the ground. The next few hours were a blur of chaos. I stayed away, letting the destruction unfold without my interference. By the time I returned, the atmosphere had shifted. The house, once full of laughter and joy, was now tense. The air felt thick, stifling. Dad was in his study, his face ashen, his hands still trembling as he clutched the trust papers, as if holding them tight enough would somehow make them disappear. Ben was pacing in the living room, the weight of what was happening settling on him. He didn't know how to fix it. I could see it in the way his eyes flicked between Dad and the papers. His bravado was gone. The confident air he had walked in with was replaced by confusion and frustration. Mom. Well, she just stared at the walls, her silence speaking louder than any words she could say. She hadn't known the extent of what I'd done. No one had. They were all too busy writing their version of the story to see mine. The story of how I had worked my ass off to save a company they couldn't even see was slipping through their fingers. The story of how I had worked to the bone, not for the glory, but because that's what was needed. I walked through the front door, my footsteps echoing as I moved toward the kitchen. There was a faint smell of champagne, still hanging in the air from the dinner. A stark contrast to the tension that now gripped the house. Ben was the first to turn and see me. He stared at me for a moment, his face twisted in disbelief. I could see the resentment in his eyes, the anger bubbling up behind the mask of confusion. But there was also something else. Fear. What did you do? He demanded, his voice shaky. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I had already said everything with those papers. He knew what I had done. He just couldn't believe it. No one could. How could you? His voice cracked, the words catching in his throat. I stood there, not moving, letting the silence stretch between us. I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I didn't owe him or anyone else an explanation for what I had done. Dad's voice rang out from the study. Aubrey. He called me like I was some errant child, like I hadn't just destroyed everything he had worked for. What the hell is going on? I didn't go to him. I wasn't going to play that role anymore. Instead, I looked at Ben one last time, my gaze steady. You think you've won. You think you've taken everything, I said, my voice low but unwavering. You have no idea what it takes to keep things alive when everything else is falling apart. You weren't here. You weren't here when it mattered. Ben didn't say anything. He just stood there, his mouth open as if searching for words that wouldn't come. I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving him standing there. Leaving them all behind. The following days blurred into one long, endless stretch of frustration and confusion. The calls kept coming in, the angry demands, the messages from the board members who were now scrambling to figure out how to untangle the mess I had left them with. The truth was, they couldn't. They were locked out. The trust was ironclad. There was no way to break it. There was no way to fix it. And as for me, I didn't have to do anything. It was done. The emails came in next, one after the other. Bank alerts. Account freezes. Payroll suspension notices. My company, my new company, had already secured its first major contract, the one they had all been waiting for. I didn't even bother picking up the phone when they called again. I had done my part. I had finished what I started. And now, I had a future that was mine and mine alone. But when I heard that final message, the one from my mother, asking if I would come back, asking for forgiveness, I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was, I had no need for them anymore. I had already left them behind, and they had no idea what was coming next. My company, Quincy Health Systems, was just getting started. And I was done waiting for their approval. I had built my own empire now. And no one was going to take that from me. Not again. As the last few pieces of the old empire fell away, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Peace. Real peace. And in that moment, I realized something that made everything worth it. I had finally taken control. It was impossible to ignore the collapse once it started. The house had become a war zone of whispers, accusations, and phone calls. Every conversation was punctuated by the word irreversible, irreversible trust, irreversible damage, irreversible loss. But even then, no one truly understood the extent of what I had done. Not yet. I kept my distance, not because I wanted to be petty, but because I knew there was no coming back. This wasn't about getting back at them, not really. This was about survival. Survival for me, for the future I had already started to build. One that didn't involve being constantly overshadowed by their expectations and their control. But Ben, he wasn't done, not by a long shot. 3 days after the inheritance dinner, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was him. "You need to fix this." Ben's voice came through the phone, his words slurred with frustration and confusion. "What the hell did you do, Aubrey? This isn't just about you. This affects all of us." I felt my stomach turn, but I didn't flinch. I had already made my decision. "It was never just about you," I replied flatly, "and it never will be." I could hear him on the other end, pacing, no doubt. "You can't just walk in and take everything. This is our family's legacy, Aubrey. I'm trying to fix it, but you," he paused, breathing heavily. "You've taken everything, and now you've destroyed it." I laughed, but there was no joy in it, only a bitter edge. "I didn't destroy it, Ben. I gave it to you. You just didn't see it for what it was." His silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't the silence of someone who understood. It was the silence of someone who couldn't comprehend the weight of what was happening. The one person who had the least right to any of it was the only one who had walked away with everything. And now, in the wreckage of it all, he was too proud to admit he was lost. "You don't understand," he said, the anger now almost choking his words. "You think this is some game. But it's not. You've ruined us." I sighed, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. "I didn't ruin anything. I just took control of what's mine. And what you and Mom and Dad never understood is that this wasn't just a business. It was everything, It was survival. And I wasn't going to let you or anyone else bury that." The line went quiet for a moment, but I could hear the sound of his breath, shallow and ragged. I could picture him standing there, fists clenched at his sides, glaring at the walls, powerless. And I knew that was the point of no return for him. I hung up before he could say anything else. The next few days dragged on in a haze. Each time I stepped into the house, I felt like a stranger. The familiar rooms had become cold, foreign, and the weight of my decision hung like a fog that wouldn't lift. It wasn't guilt. It was something heavier. A sense of finality. The world they had built for me, for us, had disintegrated, and now we were left with only the ruins. Dad didn't speak to me for days. It was as though the trust, the papers, the company, everything that had once been his, had stripped him of his will to fight. He sat in the study, staring at the walls as if waiting for something to come crashing down around him. But nothing came. There was no miraculous recovery. No undoing of the damage I had done. It was done. By the end of the week, the first of the board members had contacted me. The email was short and dry, and I could feel the tension radiating through each line. We need to discuss next steps. There was no mention of the trust. No mention of the legal standing I had secured. Just a polite request for me to reconsider my position. To meet and talk about how we can move forward. They thought I was playing a game. They thought I could be swayed by their words, by their pleas. They had no idea how far gone I was. I wasn't going back, not for them, not for anyone. I sent a single line in return, "There's nothing to discuss." I was done with them, with all of them. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal battles, cold conversations with attorneys, and angry calls from the family that had once held me together. And through it all, the reality of what I had done sunk deeper into my bones. I had stripped everything away, but I didn't feel anything anymore. No regret, no satisfaction, no anger, just silence. I built my new life in the quiet spaces they left behind. My company was thriving. Every call, every meeting, every success was mine. And with each new step forward, I felt further from them. From the people who had raised me, from the empire they had built, from the legacy I had once fought for. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I wasn't their sister. I was someone else entirely. But that didn't matter anymore, because I had what I needed: control. The company. My future. And in the end, that was all I ever really wanted. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It echoed in the empty spaces of the house, in the rooms that used to be full of voices and chaos. Now, it was just me. Alone. But somehow, that silence didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like freedom. I had let them go. I had severed the ties that had bound me to that place, to those people. I had been waiting for something, maybe for them to beg, maybe for some last-ditch effort to try and pull me back into their lives. But there was nothing. They didn't fight for me. They didn't fight for anything, not in the way that mattered. Not when it counted. I kept moving forward, even when I wanted to look back. My company, Quincy Health Systems, was now my empire. I'd built it with my own hands, from the ground up. Every sleepless night, every lonely hour spent working through problems that no one else understood. This was the reward for all of it. This was the victory. But even with all the success, I couldn't quite shake the quiet. The emptiness that followed me wherever I went. The calls from investors and board members, the messages from my assistant about meetings, contracts, progress, it all felt distant. Detached. I didn't need any of it to validate me anymore. I had done what I came to do. I had taken control of my life, of my future, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The company had secured its biggest contract yet, $62 million, with Coleman Regional Health Network. It was everything we needed to push us into the next phase, the next level. But as I sat in my office, staring out the floor to ceiling windows overlooking the city, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. I wasn't fulfilled. Not in the way I thought I would be. I had won the battle. But the war had left its scars. I thought about the old house. The one that used to feel like home. The rooms where Ben and I had grown up, where Mom and Dad had fought and loved and built a life. Now, those rooms were empty. The walls stripped of everything that had once made them ours. And somewhere inside, I felt the loss, not of the house, but of the life I had wanted. The family I had fought for. The one that had never fought for me. I glanced at my phone. Another email. Another notification from the company. Another deal to be made, another success to celebrate. But each achievement felt like a hollow echo, like a note in a song that I couldn't quite hear anymore. And then it hit me. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them anymore. I wasn't trying to make them see me, to make them proud. I had done all of that in the past. This was for me. Everything I had done, everything I had worked for, was mine. The success, the power, the freedom, it was mine to hold, to shape, to decide what came next. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I had learned that lesson the hard way. And now, I was free to build a future that was entirely mine. I could go anywhere. Do anything. I picked up my phone and looked at the message from Mom. It was simple. A single line, "Please come back. We have nothing left." I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was no going back. No fixing what had been broken. Not this time. I walked away from the past without a second thought. I blocked their numbers. I erased the old messages. I even deleted the family photos from my phone. They were ghosts. And ghosts didn't belong in my future. I turned back to the window, my reflection staring back at me. I saw someone different now. Someone stronger, Someone who had walked away from everything to build something better. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was exactly where I needed to be. I had let go of the past. I had built a new life. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally at peace with it.